Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist. Frederick Douglass was a writer. And Frederick Douglass's story epitomizes the struggle for freedom and justice. You see, he was born into slavery, but escaped, and after that he became one of the most prominent voices against the inhumanity of the slave system, using his eloquent speeches and groundbreaking autobiography to expose the brutal reality. His passionate advocacy for abolition and civil rights not only galvanized the anti-slavery movement, but also paved the way for broader social reforms in the future. And thus, it is his story, marked by his unyielding commitment to equality and empowerment, that is an absolute roller coaster. I will give it that. And for all its juicy little details, we are indeed gathered here to listen. So welcome to the my biography of Frederick Douglass, at least. The autobiography I'll perhaps link in the description, and you can read it through his own words. But for now, let's get all nice and comfortable, and let's all click the like and subscribe button, and we can begin. Did you click it? Great. Now we start. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born into a slave system in Talbot County, Maryland, on the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. Now, at the time of his birth, his family was associated with a plantation located between Hillsborough and Cordova, likely near his grandmother's cabin, which stood west of Tuckahoe Creek and east of Tapper's Corner. Because enslaved people were seldom provided with precise birth records, the exact date of his birth is always uncertain. This pretty much goes for most people born into slavery. In his first autobiography, Douglass had noted, I quote, "I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it." Later in his life, he gave 1817 as a probable year of his birth, while acknowledging that a more precise date is just impossible. Though uncertain of the precise day, Douglass chose to celebrate his birthday on February 14th, largely inspired by a pet name from his mother Harriet Bailey, who called him her Little Valentine. In his efforts to piece together his heritage, Douglass learned that his father might have been his mother's enslaver. According to another biography by David Blight, Douglass spent much of his life searching in vain for conclusive information about his paternity. His mother, on the other hand, was of African descent, and his father, so far as Douglass had ever discovered, was probably of European descent. But, well, that's pretty much where the trail runs cold. Although Douglass's lineage may have also included Native American influences, he was never able to confirm these details. In 1845, in his narrative, Douglass stated plainly, "My father was a white man." His mother gave him the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, but after fleeing enslavement in September 1838, he dropped his two middle names upon reaching safe territory in the north and simply adopted the name Douglass. So there we have the modern rendering, which we'll continue to use throughout the talk, Frederick Douglass. That was one of the several names that he would use before deciding on the version history most recognizes today. Separated from his mother during infancy, a young Frederick initially lived in the care of his maternal grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who was also enslaved, and his maternal grandfather, Isaac, who was actually free. Betsy's presence offered him a semblance of family stability in the midst of harsh constraints imposed by slavery. Harriet Bailey resided on a different part of the plantation, about 12 miles away, and only managed a handful of visits before dying when Frederick was around 7 years old. This early separation meant that Douglass grew up lacking a consistent maternal figure, further showing his sense of uncertainty about his origins. But much later, actually, in 1883, Douglass actually made a significant return to Talbot County, invited to speak at a colored school, as it were. He also chose to buy land in the area, seeking to honor the place of his birth and early childhood. The gesture carried deep emotional weight, as his memories of that part of Maryland, and especially of his grandmother's small cabin, had always retained a special place in his life. Even as he rose to prominence as an orator, writer, and abolitionist, Douglass never entirely escaped the questions surrounding his earliest years, his parentage, and the painful reality that he had been born into slavery. When Douglass was 6 years old, he was taken from his grandparents and placed on the Wye House plantation, where Edward Lloyd served as his unofficial master and Aaron Anthony as his overseer. Following Anthony's death in 1826, Douglass was given to Thomas Ould's wife, Lucretia Ould, who sent him to Baltimore to work for Thomas's brother, Hugh Ould, and his wife, Sophia. Sophia made sure Douglass was fed and clothed appropriately, and that he slept in a bed with blankets and sheets. From the moment he arrived, in contrast to those on plantations, Douglass felt fortunate to be in the city, where he claimed that enslaved people were nearly free men. He described her as gentle and kind, and said that she treated him as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. Suppose that's all you can really ask for, isn't it? Douglass persisted in teaching himself to read and write in secret. As he started reading newspapers, pamphlets, political materials, and books of all kinds, he developed a new way of thinking that led him to question and criticize the system of slavery. He would later say that knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom. Quite right. Quite rightly indeed. Write that down. Put it on the wall above your desk, everybody. That's your homework. Douglass later claimed that his understanding of freedom and human rights was defined and clarified by an anthology he came across at the age of 12, The Columbian Orator. This book, which was first published in 1797, is a classroom reader that includes speeches, dialogues, and essays to help the students learn grammar and reading. Later on, he discovered that his mother had also been literate, and he would subsequently say, "I am quite willing, and even happy, to attribute any love of letters I possess, and for all which I have got, despite of prejudices, only too much credit, and to my admitted Anglo-Saxon paternity, but to the native genius of my sable, unprotected, and uncultivated mother, a woman who belonged to a race whose mental endowments it is at present fashionable to hold in disparagement and contempt." After being hired by William Freeland, Douglass gathered eventually more than 30 male slaves on Sundays, sometimes even on weeknights, in Sabbath literacy schools. Douglass later wrote, as a means of punishing Hugh, after Thomas Ould repelled him from Hugh in 1833, Edward Covey was a poor farmer, with a reputation as a slave breaker who hired Douglass. Douglass's wounds had little time to heal because he was whipped so often. Douglass later claimed that his body, soul, and spirit were broken by the frequent beatings, but at last, at the age of 16, he rebelled and resisted the constant thrashing. Covey never attempted to beat Douglass again after he prevailed in a physical altercation. You can only push people so far, can't you? Yes, it's a bit different when you hit back. Well, in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, as it's called, Douglass described the brutal beatings he endured at Covey's farm, calling himself a man transformed into a brute. Yet he considered the physical struggle with Covey life-altering, and opened his autobiography declaring, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." Douglass first attempted to flee Freeland, who had hired him from his owner, but failed. In 1837 he met with Anna Murray, a free black woman in Baltimore about 5 years older than him. Her freedom deepened his hope that he too one day might be free. Murray offered him both financial help and material support. On September 3rd, 1838, Douglass succeeded in escaping by boarding a northbound Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad train in Baltimore. It was once believed he embarked near what is now the Harbor East and Little Italy neighborhoods. But research cited in 2021 indicates that he actually boarded at the railroad's Canton Depot on Boston Street further east. Traveling along the southwest shore of the Susquehanna River to Havre de Grace, Maryland, he then used the railroad's steam ferry to cross into Perryville. Although he was just 20 miles from the Maryland-Pennsylvania line, it was simpler to keep going by rail through Delaware, another slave state, before continuing northeast by steamboat to Philadelphia, the Quaker City. From there, he proceeded to abolitionist David Ruggles' safe house in New York City, arriving in under 24 hours. He carried a naval men's officer's identification, or rather a naval member's identification, and protection papers borrowed from a free black sailor, wore a sailor's uniform Murray had given him, and used part of her savings to cover expenses. Shortly afterward, he sent for Murray, who traveled north and joined him. On September the 15th, 1838, 11 days after his arrival, they were married by a black Presbyterian minister, and briefly assumed the married name Johnson to avoid scrutiny. In his youth, Douglass had occasionally listened to Sophia Auld read the Bible, sparking his interest in literacy and ultimately leading him to become a Christian. Mentored by Reverend Charles Lawson, he often employed religious imagery in his speeches. Though devout, Douglass condemned the hypocrisy of slave-holding Christians, labeling them wicked, and contrasting the Christianity of Christ with the Christianity of America. He regarded slave-holding ministers and believers who endorsed slavery as particularly vicious wolves in sheep's clothing. Thus he continued to fiercely condemn religious figures who stayed silent on the issue. Notably in his address at Rochester's Corinthian Hall, he denounced ministers for blasphemy when they presented slavery as God-endorsed, calling pro-slavery clergymen's teachings a distortion of the true faith. He cited John Chase Lord, Leonard Elijah Lathrop, Ichabod Spencer, and Orville Dewey for teaching that human law outranked God's word. Yet Douglass acknowledged a few exceptional ministers, such as Henry Ward Beecher, Samuel May, and Robert Raymond, who fought against slavery. He urged these men to spur abolition through sermons, religious pressures, and missionary societies, declaring if they rose against the system of crime and blood, then it would surely collapse. During his visits to Britain in 1846 and 1848, Douglass implored British Christians not to aid American churches complicit in slavery. Delighted by some to Belfast ministers' refusal to accept slaveholders, he repeated this refrain: "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." In his 1848 letter to Thomas Auld, Douglass rebuked his former master for denying his family literacy. After returning to America, he founded the weekly publication, The North Star. A deeply spiritual man, Douglass had been seen as a precursor to the non-denominational libertarian philosophy. His home's mantel displayed busts of Ludwig Feuerbach and David Friedrich Strauss. His works on Christianity greatly influenced him. His library contained Bibles, religious texts, images of Christ, angels, and views of Washington's Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church. Like other Christian abolitionists, he avoided alcohol and other perceived vices, though it has been noted that he loved cigars. Well, I suppose we can make a little exception, can't we? Well, Douglass praised an agnostic orator in Peoria, Illinois, arguing that the virtue could be found both within and beyond church walls. Douglass and Anna Murray then had 5 children: Rosetta, Louis, Henry, Frederick Jr., and Charles Raymond. Anna supported his public work and helped run his newspapers alongside their eldest children. 2 professional relationships, one with Julia Griffiths and with German journalist Ottilie Assing, sparked a few rumors. Assing, who came to Douglass in 1856 seeking permission to translate My Bondage and My Freedom, became his intellectual and emotional companion, often staying at his home for months at a time until 1872. Yeah, no wonder they were sparking rumors. Well, Anna Douglass held utter contempt for Ottilie Assing, who naively hoped Douglass would leave his wife. According to David Blight, Assing and Douglass were probably lovers, though surviving letters made no definitive proof. Anna died in 1882, and in 1884, Douglass married Helen Pitts, a white abolitionist and suffragist, nearly 20 years his junior. She was the daughter of Gideon Pitts, Jr., Douglass's friend and fellow abolitionist, who worked as Douglass's secretary in Washington, D.C. Upon hearing of the marriage, Assing, diagnosed with incurable breast cancer, took her own life in France. Yeah, they were obviously together, surely. I mean, come on. But she did leave Douglass a $13,000 trust fund. It's about $400,000 today, along with a whole bunch of books and a large album. Douglass's new marriage provoked controversy, of course, as many thought it disrespected Anna's memory. Pitt's relatives ended contact with her, and Douglass's own children took it as a slight against their mother. Not all reactions were negative, though. One Elizabeth Cady Stanton congratulated them. In response, Douglass said that he had married a woman of my mother's colors first, and then of my father's color. Remember, his father was white. Following his 1838 escape from slavery, Douglass and Anna settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, an abolitionist center. They lived with Nathan and Mary Johnson, who helped Douglass adopt the new surname. He had been Bailey, then briefly Stanley and Johnson, before Nathan was actually the one who suggested Douglass, inspired by Sir Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake. In 1841, the couple moved to Lynn, where Douglass's growing awareness of segregation led him to refuse a segregated coach seat on the Eastern Railroad. He and his friend, James N. Buffum, were forcibly removed by the guards from the train at Lynn Central Square Station. Douglass initially considered joining a white Methodist church, was unfortunately disheartened by its segregated structure. He joined the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which also counted Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth as its members. Licensed to preach, in 1839 he honed his oratory skills by serving as a sexton, Sunday school superintendent, and a steward. Douglass spoke in Elmira, New York in 1840, and soon a black congregation grew there, eventually becoming the area's largest church by 1940. Throughout this period, Douglass attended abolitionist gatherings and joined several New Bedford organizations, He subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, crediting it with second place in his heart only to the Bible. Garrison, likewise impressed by Douglass, had written favorably about his anti-colonialist views. In 1841, Douglass attended a Garrison lecture in New Bedford and spoke himself for the first time. That appearance led to his speech at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's convention in Nantucket, where at only 23 he overcame his anxiety and stirred listeners with his account of enslavement. In 1843, Douglass joined the American Anti-Slavery Society's 100 Conventions tour across the eastern and midwestern United States. He faced frequent harassment, and while speaking in Pendleton, Indiana, was attacked by a violent mob before being rescued by local Quakers, the Hardys. His hand was broken, leaving him with lasting pain. A stone marker in Pendleton's Falls Park now commemorates the assault. In 1847, Douglass wrote to William Lloyd Garrison, saying, "I have no love for America. The institutions of these countries do not recognize me as a man." Around the same time, he published his first autobiography, entitled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written in Lynn, Massachusetts. It was an instant bestseller. It was reprinted 9 times in 3 years and circulated 11,000 copies, later appearing in Europe in Dutch and French. Doubters questioned how a man of color could produce such a powerful work, and thought that it was simply some white guy writing. But over his lifetime, Douglass would write 3 autobiographies, each building on the previous one. His 1845 narrative likely helped him raise funds to purchase his freedom in 1846. He followed it with My Bondage and Freedom in 1855, then Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, revising the later in 1892. Fearing his former owner, Hugh Auld, might try to reclaim him amid growing fame, Douglass followed friends' advice and sailed for Liverpool on August 16, 1845, later arriving in Ireland during the Great Famine. Not the best time to be in Ireland, by the way. While exhilarated by the absence of the American-style racial discrimination, he was disturbed by the extreme poverty of Dublin, which he pretty much said reminded him of enslavement anyway. In a letter to Garrison, he wrote, "He who really and truly feels for the American slave cannot steel his heart to the woes of others." He befriended Irish nationalist and abolitionist David O'Connell, whose passion deeply influenced him. During nearly 2 years in Ireland and Great Britain, Douglass lectured in chapels filled to suffocation, including his triumphant London reception speech at Alexander Fletcher's Finsbury Chapel in May of 1846. He noted that, in England, he was treated not as a colour, but as a man. That same year, Douglass met Thomas Clarkson, the famed abolitionist instrumental in ending slavery through Britain's colonies. Supporters in Britain, led by Anna and Ellen Richardson of the Newcastle upon Tyne, gathered funds to buy Douglass's freedom from Thomas Auld. And so now, legally free, Douglass returned to America in the spring of 1847, soon after O'Connell's death, determined to reunite with his wife in Massachusetts and fight for the millions still enslaved. In the 21st century, Douglass's visit was commemorated by historical plaques installed on Cork and Waterford, Ireland, as well as London. You can go and see them too. Actually, Belfast has a statue of Douglass on High Street as well. They did that in just last year, I believe, or the year before. Might have been the year before. Anyway, Douglass was named Scotland's anti-slavery agent after spending time there writing letters and delivering speeches against slavery. He praised Edinburgh for its beauty and hospitality, and a mural and plaque at 33 Gilmore Place commemorated his 1846 stay. Now, upon returning to the United States in 1847, he used £500 from English supporters to launch his abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, in Rochester, New York. Initially co-edited by Martin Delaney, it soon became Douglas's solo venture. Douglas and his wife also sheltered more than 400 freedom seekers in their home. But Douglas would soon split with William Lloyd Garrison, who deemed the Constitution pro-slavery and even burned copies of it in protest. Influenced by Lysander's Spooner's The Unconstitutionality of Slavery in 1846, Douglas reversed his earlier views and concluded that the Constitution could be used to combat slavery. This shift, around 1847, marks a significant rift in the abolitionist movement. You see Douglas's speeches such as "Is the United States Constitution for or against slavery?" and "The Constitution of the United States, is it pro or anti-slavery?" in 1851 and 1860 respectively, explained his change of heart. He argued that dissolving the Union, as Garrison favored, would leave enslaved people entirely under the power of slave states. Thus, he maintained, true abolition demanded using every constitutional means to restore stolen rights. On the 10th anniversary of his escape, in September of 1848, Douglas wrote an open letter to Thomas Auld, his former master, criticizing his behavior and asking how family members who were still in Auld's custody. Douglas skillfully switches between formal and restrained, familiar, and then passionate throughout the letter. He is proud parent at one point, talking about how his situation has improved and how his own 4 young children are doing. However, he then abruptly changes tone. I'll read a little passage from the letter now. "Oh, sir, a slaveholder never appears to me so completely an agent of hell, and when I think of it and look upon my dear children, it is then that my feelings rise above my control. The grim horrors of slavery rise in all their ghastly terror before me. The wails of millions pierce my heart and chill my blood. I remember the chain, the gag, the bloody whip, the death-like gloom overshadowing the broken spirit of the fettered bondman, the appalling liability of his being torn away from wife and children, so being sold like a beast in a market." End of the letter. Douglas wrote a striking passage to Hugh Auld, describing how he would feel if Douglas took Auld's daughter Amanda into slavery and treated her as Auld treated him. Although he harbored no malice, Douglas concluded that Auld would find no safer shelter than Douglas's own home, where he would freely share anything for his comfort. In 1848, Douglas was the only black attendee at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's resolution urging women's suffrage met strong opposition, including from Quakers James and Lucretia Mott. Douglas rose to endorse women's voting rights, proclaiming that he could not accept suffrage himself if it were denied to women. After the convention, he used his newspaper, the North Star, to promote women's rights, commending the marked ability and dignity of the proceedings and condemning critics who dismissed the woman's demands. Douglas noted parallels between feminism and abolition, reaffirming in a subsequent letter the paper's stance, "We hold women to be justly entitled to all we claim for men." Following the Civil War, Douglas diverged from Stanton over the proposed 15th Amendment. While Stanton opposed granting voting rights to black men before women, Douglas worried that linking the two causes could doom both of them. He believed that white women already had their influence through their fathers, husbands, and brothers, and that once black men secured suffrages, black women would share that advantage too. Though this disagreement distanced him from Stanton, Douglas repeatedly affirmed that he was never against women's enfranchisement. Meanwhile, he helped establish the American League of Colored Laborers, the nation's first black labor union, and served as its vice president in 1850. The following year, he merged the North Star with Gerrit Smith's Liberty Party journal to form Frederick Douglass's paper, which ran until 1859. Douglass spoke at a gathering hosted by the Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society on July 5, 1852 in Corinthian Hall. He was well known as a participant in the radical Abolitionist National African American Convention in Rochester in 1853, where he delivered what became known as "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." One biographer described it as perhaps the greatest anti-slavery oration ever given. Douglass was one of the 5 individuals whose names appeared on the convention's address to the American people, which was published under the heading "The Claims of Our Common Cause." Henry O. Waggoner, George Boyer Vachon, James Monroe Whitfield, and Amos Noé Freeman were the other 4. Douglass was also an early supporter of the school desegregation, because like many abolitionists, he thought that education would be essential for African Americans to improve their situations. He noted in the 1850s that African American children in New York received far less facilities for education than European Americans. Douglass demanded that the courts take action to allow all children to enter schools. He asserted that African Americans' needs for full inclusion in the educational system outweighed political concerns like suffrage. Douglass also discussed emancipation with radical abolitionists like John Brown, George de Baptiste, and others on March 12, 1859, at William Webb's Detroit home. 2 months prior to leading the Harper's Ferry raid, Douglass had another encounter with Brown when he came to his house. During his 2 weeks with Douglass, Brown wrote his provisional constitution. As he frequently did, Douglass also stayed with Shields Green, a runaway slave, for more than a year. Douglass took Green with him when he traveled from Rochester to Brown's communications headquarters in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, via New York City, just prior to the raid. Blacks there recognized him and invited him to give a talk. Douglass concurred, but claimed that slavery was the only subject he covered. Brown sat in the audience, unidentified, while Green joined him on stage. Well, it was described as a flaming address, the notorious black orator, by a white reporter. The name of the actual talk I cannot say without having my entire channel being demonetized, so let's just call it Black Democracy. Do apologize for the unintentional censorship on that one. So in order to maintain confidentiality, Douglass and Green met with Brown and John Henry Cargie in an abandoned stone quarry to talk about the raid, after what Douglass described as a day and a night of talks. He let Brown down by refusing to accompany him because he thought the mission was doomed from the start, which it pretty much was. Well, Brown wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. If you've watched my video about him, you'll know what I'm talking about there. David Blight described this as much more of an ex post facto bitterness than reality. You see, Green chose to accompany Brown rather than accompany Douglass back to Rochester, which was a big surprise to Douglass. But Anne Brown claimed that Green informed her that Douglass promised to reimburse him upon his return. Douglass is largely responsible for what is known about this incident. Not going with John Brown was obviously a life-changing event for him. Could have been a life-ending event for him if he did go. And it also had significant impact on his public persona. You see, Douglass kept this whole meeting a secret for 20 years. Nobody knew about this. During his unsuccessful attempt to raise funds to support a John Brown professorship at Storer College, which would likely be held by a black man, he first revealed it in his 1881 speech on John Brown. Suddenly he also mentions it once more in his final autobiography. Well, following this raid, which occurred between October 16th and 18th, 1859, Douglass was charged with both aiding and abetting John Brown. After coming dangerously close to being arrested on a Virginia warrant, he briefly fled to Canada before continuing on to England for a prearranged lecture tour, arriving there at the end of November. Douglass presented his opinions on the American Constitution in a speech titled "The Constitution of the United States, Is It Pro or Anti-Slavery?" to the Scottish Anti-Slavery Society in Glasgow, March 26, 1860. Annie, Douglass's youngest daughter, at this time passed away in Rochester, New York, at the age of 10. The following month, Douglass sailed back from England, passing through Canada to avoid detection. One of the most well-known black men in the nation by the time of the Civil War, Douglass was well known for his speeches about the state of the black race and other topics like women's rights. At every venue, his eloquence attracted large crowds. His reputation was enhanced by the way he was received by Irish and English leaders. Everyone respected him. When his term ended in 1854, his friend and supporter Gerrit Smith declined to run again, but he had seriously been considered for his congressional seat. Because of strenuous objections from members of Congress, Smith advised him not to run. If the House agreed to seat him, which was very unlikely, all the Southern members would walk out, causing the nation to finally be split. The possibility afflicted some with convulsions, others with panic, or with an astonishing flow exceedingly select and nervous language, giving vent to all sorts of linguistic enormities, as it was said at the time. What a beautiful way to describe it. It wasn't until 1870, actually, shortly after the 15th Amendment was ratified, that a person of color would actually hold a position in Congress. Douglass and the abolitionists maintained that African Americans should be permitted to participate in the struggle for freedom, since the Civil War was intended to abolish slavery. Douglass made the viewpoint widely known through his speeches and publications. He also published his well-known broadside, "Men of Color to Arms," to aid in the recruitment efforts after Lincoln had finally permitted black soldiers to serve in the army. March 21st, 1863. Charles Douglass, his eldest son, enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, but spent a large portion of his time in the military sick. At the Battle of Fort Wagner, Lewis Douglass participated too. Frederick Douglass Jr., another son, was also a recruiter. Douglass battled for equality for his people after the North was released from its obligation to return slaves to their owners to the South. In 1863, Douglass met with President Abraham Lincoln to discuss plans to relocate free slaves from the South and how to treat black soldiers. All slaves in Confederate-held territory were declared free on January 1st, 1863 by President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But slaves in Union-held areas were not covered, because the proclamation was only allowed under the Constitution as a war measure. They were set free on December 6th, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was adopted. Well, Douglass characterized the mood of those who were waiting for the proclamation. He wrote thusly: "We were waiting and listening as for a bolt from the sky. We were watching, by the dim light of the stars, the dawn of a new day. We were longing for the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries." While the U.S. Douglass-backed abolitionist Radical Democracy Party candidate John C. Fremont in the 1864 presidential election, Douglass was disappointed that President Lincoln did not openly support black freedmen's right to vote. Douglass felt that African American men should have the right to vote because they were serving in the Union Army during Civil War. Well, following the war, the 13th Amendment was ratified December 6, 1865, which made it illegal to have slaves, except as punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment guaranteed birthright citizenship and forbade states from denying any person equal protection under the law or due process of law. All citizens were shielded from racial discrimination in voting by the 15th Amendment. Douglass discussed black suffrage with President Andrew Johnson following Lincoln's assassination. Douglass gave the keynote address at the dedication of the Emancipation Memorial in Lincoln Park, Washington, on April 17, 1876. He discussed Lincoln's complicated legacy openly, pointing out on both the good and bad qualities he thought the president had. I quote, "He had been ready and willing at any time, the first years of his administration, to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the humanity of colored people to promote the welfare of white people. Lincoln was neither our man nor our model." Not the best review, isn't it? Well, he pointed out that Lincoln had initially opposed the expansion of slavery, but did not support its abolition. He continued, "Can any colored man or any white man, friendly to the freedom of all men, ever forget the night which followed the first day of January 1863, when the world was to see if Abraham Lincoln would prove to be as good as his word?" He further stated, "Though Mr. Lincoln shared the prejudices of his white fellow countrymen against the blacks, it's hardly necessary to say in his heart of hearts he loathed and hated slavery." Viewed from genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent, but measuring him by the sentiment of his country, and a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. His speech awakened the audience, and Douglass received a standing ovation, probably saying a few things that some people wanted to say, but they weren't quite sure how to say them. Douglass is said to have received Lincoln's favorite walking stick as a token of gratitude from his widow, Mary Lincoln. His last home, Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C., which is now protected as Frederick Douglass National Historical Site, is still where that same walking stick is kept. Well, following the war, white insurgents swiftly emerged in the South, initially forming as a covert vigilante operation such as the Klan. The forms of armed insurgency varied. The White League and the Red Shirts were two strong parliamentary organizations that organized in the Deep South in the 1870s. They disrupted elections and turned out Republican office holders in their capacity as the military arm of the Democratic Party. Let me say it again, the Democratic Party. Isn't it weird how that works? Bit of a reverse card on you there. You see, Democrats reclaimed political power in all of the former Confederate states and started to reaffirm white supremacy 10 years after the war. They accomplished this through a combination of violence, segregation laws from the late 19th century, and a determined attempt to deny African Americans the right to vote. The freedom was also curtailed by new labor and criminal laws. Not quite back to the plantation, but certainly not welcomed with open arms, rather, that's for sure. Douglass backed Ulysses S. Grant's 1868 presidential campaign in an attempt to thwart these initiatives. In an effort to uphold his nation's commitment to equality, Douglass founded the New National Era, his final newspaper, in 1870. Along with Douglass, President Grant dispatched a congressionally sponsored commission to the West Indies to look into the potential benefits of annexing Santo Domingo for the U.S. Grant thought that by giving African Americans their own state, annexation would help ease the violent situation in the South. Congress continued to oppose the plan, despite Douglass and the commissioners' support. According to Douglass, if Senator Charles Sumner persisted in his opposition to annexation, he would regard him as the worst foe of the colored race has on this continent. Following the midterm elections, Grant signed the Second and Third Enforcement Acts, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1871, popularly referred to as the Ku Klux Klan Act. Grant made extensive use of their provisions, sending troops to South Carolina and other states, suspending habeas corpus there. More than 5,000 arrests were made while he was in charge. Although many white people disliked Grant for his vigorous efforts to dismantle the Klan, Douglass, of course, praised him for it. Because, of course he would. I'm sure he wasn't the only one praising him for it, but you see, the Klan at this point, I don't think it was quite at its zenith. I think its zenith came after they released the movie, I think. I'll have to do a full video on them. That will be an interesting video, that's for sure. Well, it was written by Douglass's associate that African Americans will ever cherish a grateful remembrance of Grant's name, fame, and great service. Well, Douglass became the president of the Freedmen's Savings Bank in late March, but the bank failed on June 29, 1874. His last newspaper, the New National Era, went out of business in September. That same economic downturn was pretty harsh for everybody. Douglass became the first person of color actually appointed in the United States Marshal for the District of Columbia when Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president. On March 17, 1877, he was confirmed by the U.S. Senate. By accepting the position, Douglass contributed to the financial stability of his family. Since he was never asked to introduce visiting foreign dignitaries to the president, which is one of the regular responsibilities of that position, Douglass's supporters urged him to resign from his commission during his tenure. Douglass, however, claimed that he was welcomed in presidential circles, and that he did not think a mission implied any overt racism. When Douglass paid his former slave master Thomas Auld a visit on his deathbed in 1877, the two men finally made amends. A few years earlier, Douglass had met Amanda Auld, Sears Auld's daughter. After requesting the meeting, she went to one of Douglass's speeches and applauded. Her father praised her for contacting Douglass. Seemed like everything was water under the bridge now, which, I don't think I would have been so forgiving, but hey. Douglass also seems to have found closure as a result of the visit, of course, despite some criticizing his attempt. In the same year, Douglass purchased the house on a hill above Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. This would become the family's final residence. It was given the name Cedar Hill by him and Anna. They added a china closet and increased the house's size from 14 to 21 rooms. Douglass increased the size of the property to 15 acres a year by acquiring the adjacent lots. As the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, the house is currently protected too. The final edition of Douglass's autobiography was published in 1881. Douglass revised it in 1892. He was named the District of Columbia's Recorder of Deeds in 1881. Douglass also persisted in traveling and giving speeches, both at home and overseas. From 1886 to 87, he and his new wife, Helen, traveled throughout the United Kingdom, stopping in Wales, Ireland, France, Italy, Egypt, and Greece, and in Ireland must have raised a few eyebrows back in England, apparently at the invitation of the abolitionist Jessie Donaldson. He backed Charles Stewart Parnell and gained notoriety for supporting Irish Home Rule. Of course, The people back in London do not like that idea very much. Well, in order to have more freedom and autonomy, many African Americans, known as the Exodusters, fled the Klan and the racially discriminatory laws in the South by relocating to Kansas, where they established all black towns. Now, Douglass did not support the Back to Africa movement, let alone this movement, the all black towns, because really it's just segregation all over again, isn't it? The latter reminded him, though, of the American Colonization Society, which he had resisted as a young man. Bishop Henry McNeill Turner called a conference in Indianapolis in 1892, where Douglass spoke out against these separatist movements and urged African Americans to resist. As early as 1879, he gave similar speeches which drew criticism from audiences and other leaders alike. Some even jeered him on the stance. In 1894, he stated in a speech in Baltimore, "I hope and trust all will come out right in the end, but the immediate future looks dark and trouble. I cannot shut my eyes to the ugly facts before me." In 1892, Douglass built black rental housing in Baltimore Fells Point neighborhood, which is now called Douglass Place. The complex was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2003 and still in existence today. Douglass attended a National Council of Women meeting on Washington, D.C., February 20, 1895. He was brought to the platform and given a standing ovation. But soon after this, at the age of 77, he passed away from a heart attack not long after he got home. Thousands of people came to pay their respects by passing by his coffin at his funeral. Pallbearers included Supreme Court justices and U.S. senators. A masterly address was given by Howard University President Jeremiah Rankin. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's letter was read too. The Haitian legation secretary expressed their condolences of his country in melodious French. Well, thank you very much. That is the end of the life of Frederick Douglass. Hope you enjoyed that one. I want to thank the patrons who are keeping the channel going, of course, as Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfadnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, and the HMS HH. Thank you very much, everyone. And I will see you in the next video. Good night for now. Lots of love to you all.